In today's notes, we'll be taking a look at important people and events from the early years of the civil rights movement. To begin with, we're going to go back several decades to the late 1800s, the 1890s. In 1896, in the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment, which guarantees all Americans equal treatment under the law. So from that point on, from 1896 all the way up until 1954, almost 90 years, separate but equal was the law of the land, the law of the United States. It was legal to segregate the races. It was legal to have accommodations like in this picture, separate drinking fountains for whites and for African Americans or colored persons. During World War I, when many white males were sent off to serve in the war, that opened up a number of jobs in the North, which led to the great migration of African Americans from the South into northern industrial centers. They went for the work. They also went believing that they would have increased rights in those northern cities. What they found instead was still a lot of racial prejudice and segregation in the northern cities. In many ways, it was the events of World War II that set the stage for the civil rights movement. First, the demand for soldiers in the early 1940s created a shortage of white male laborers. That labor shortage opened up new job opportunities for African Americans, Latinos, and women. Second, nearly 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces, which needed so many fighting men that they had to end their discriminatory policies. Such policies had previously kept African Americans from serving in fighting units. Many African American soldiers returned from the war determined to fight for their own freedom now that they had helped defeat fascist regimes overseas. Third, during the war, civil rights organizations actively campaigned for African American voting rights and challenged Jim Crow laws. In response to protests, President Roosevelt issued a presidential directive prohibiting racial discrimination by federal agencies and all companies that were engaged in war work. The groundwork had been laid for more organized campaigns to end segregation throughout the United States. A major victory was won for civil rights in the 1954 Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. Renowned NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall represented the Brown side of Brown versus Board of Education. In this case, the father of 8-year-old Linda Brown had charged that the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was violating Linda's rights by denying her admission to an all-white elementary school that was 4 blocks from her house. Instead, she had to walk to the nearest all-black elementary school, which was 21 blocks away. Marshall argued that this segregation was certainly separate, but was not equal. The Supreme Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled in favor of Marshall and the Brown family. Chief Justice Warren summed up the decision of the Supreme Court, stating, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." Within a year of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, more than 500 school districts had desegregated their classrooms. However, in many areas where African Americans were a majority, whites resisted desegregation. One such place was in Little Rock, Arkansas, at Little Rock Central High School. In September of 1957, 9 African American students, known as the Little Rock Nine, volunteered to help integrate the schools of Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Fabus, ordered the National Guard to turn away these students. The NAACP members called 8 of the 9 students and arranged to drive them to school to keep them away from harassment and potential violence. But they were unable to reach the 9th student, shown in this picture. Her name was Elizabeth Eckford, and she did not have a phone, so they weren't able to reach her. Instead, she set out alone, and outside of Central High School, Eckford faced an abusive crowd. Terrified, the 15-year-old made it to the bus stop, where two friendly white citizens stayed with her until she reached the high school. The resistance to allow these students to integrate the high school of Little Rock forced the president to act. President Eisenhower placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control, meaning they were under the control of the president, and he ordered 1,000 paratroopers into Little Rock to protect these 9 students and to see that they were allowed to attend the high school. The nation watched the televised coverage of the event, and under the watch of the soldiers, the 9 African American teenagers were able to attend class. During the school year, of course, those soldiers were not able to keep these 9 students completely out of harm's way. They routinely were harassed by other students. And a year later, in September of 1957, rather than comply with the integration, the governor of Arkansas, Governor Fabus, shut down Central High School. On December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress and NAACP officer, took a seat in the front row of the colored section of a Montgomery bus. As the bus filled up, the driver ordered Parks and 3 other African American passengers to empty the row they were occupying so that a white man could sit down without having to sit next to any African Americans. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down, recalled Parks. As Parks stared out the window, the bus driver said, "If you don't stand up, I'm going to call the police and have you arrested." The soft-spoken Parks simply replied, "You may do that." News of Parks' arrest spread rapidly. A bus boycott was suggested, and the leaders of the African American community, including many ministers, formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to organize the boycott. They elected the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., to lead the group. For 381 days, African Americans refused to ride the buses in Montgomery. In many cases, they had to find other means of transportation. They organized carpools or walked long distances. Support came from within the black community. Workers donated 1/5 of their weekly salaries to the cause, as well as from outside groups like the NAACP, the United Auto Workers, Montgomery's Jewish community, and sympathetic white Southerners. The boycotters remained nonviolent even after a bomb ripped apart Martin Luther King's home. Finally, in 1956, a little over a year after the boycott began, the Supreme Court outlawed bus segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott proved to the world that the African American community could unite and organize a successful protest movement. After the bus boycott ended, King joined with ministers and civil rights leaders to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Its purpose was to carry on nonviolent crusades against the evils of second-class citizenship. They practiced something known as civil disobedience, meaning they willingly broke laws that they believed were unjust, in this case, the laws of segregation. Martin Luther King called his brand of nonviolent resistance soul force. He based his ideas on the teachings of several people. From Jesus, he learned to love one's enemies. From the writer Henry David Thoreau, he took the concept of civil disobedience, the refusal to obey an unjust law. And from labor organizer A. Philip Randolph, he learned to organize massive demonstrations. And from Gandhi, the leader who helped India throw off British rule, he learned to resist oppression without violence. The SCLC set up branches in cities all across the South. And in April of 1960, students at Shaw University, an African American university in Raleigh, North Carolina, organized a national protest group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, nicknamed SNCC. It had been 6 years since the Brown decision, and many college students viewed the pace of change as far too slow. Although these students risked a great deal. They could lose college scholarships, possibly be expelled, or be physically harmed, they were determined to challenge the system. SNCC hoped to harness the energy of these student protesters. It would soon create one of the most important student activist movements in our nation's history. In February of 1960, African American students that belonged to SNCC started the practice of sit-ins, that is, sitting at segregated lunch counters and waiting to be served. This wasn't the first time this had happened. It had happened in northern cities back in the mid-40s, but this time was different because it was caught by television news cameras. They broadcast these daily sit-ins, not only in North Carolina where they originated, but eventually in cities all over the South. And people all across the country saw whites beating, jeering at, and pouring food over students who refused to strike back. By late 1960, students had descended on and desegregated lunch counters in some 48 cities in 11 different states. They endured arrests, beatings, suspension from college, and tear gas and fire hoses. But the army of nonviolent students refused to back down. These are some of the initial steps of the civil rights movement, some of the initial major events. In our next section of notes, we'll be looking at some major successes that the civil rights movement is able to achieve.